Hello, and thank you for joining us today from wherever you are in the world. My name is Reed Blakemore, Deputy Director of the Global Energy Center here at the Atlantic Council, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, The Role of Minerals in U.S. Transportation Electrification, which marks the launch of a report of the same name that I've been fortunate enough to work on for the past several months. Following the signing of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act yesterday, and just a few days after the conclusion of COP26 in Glasgow, we couldn't be launching this paper at a more timely moment. The administration's pledge to bring electric vehicle sales to 50% of the consumer car market is central to its plans to deploy clean energy infrastructure under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and is also critical to tackle the 30% of domestic greenhouse gas emissions originating from transportation. Yet, as the United States begins to lay a path to realize these ambitions and implement legislation for transportation electrification, the role of minerals and metals in powering these goals cannot be forgotten. In fact, as the United States enters a crowded global playing field for supplies of key transition minerals and metals, ensuring sufficient access to a robust, sustainable, and secure mineral supply chain is the first of many items on the to-do list. With that in mind, I'm glad that we're launching this report and holding this expert panel today, as it's an important initial step to explore the minerals-related challenges and opportunities present throughout the electrification of the U.S. automotive sector, as well as looking at the pathways to ensure that the mineral intensity of that transition is not an obstacle to the ambitions for climate actions and economic growth enshrined with those goals in the first place. Now, before we get started, I'd like to thank a few individuals for their contributions to this report, in particular our team here at the Global Energy Center, as well as the National Mining Association, who was a valuable partner in helping to complete this work. To that end, before we begin, I'd like to welcome Rich Nolan, President and CEO of the National Mining Association, to offer some initial remarks. Rich, over to you. Oh.
Good morning. Can you hear me now?
Yep, all set.
I'm Rich Nolan, President and CEO of the National Mining Association. I want to say thank you to Reed Blakemore and the team at the Atlantic Council for their work on the paper they're releasing today, which shines a spotlight on the absolutely indispensable role that minerals will play in securing transportation electrification goals here in the United States. Now, we're all well aware that this administration has a bold, aggressive agenda when it comes to electric vehicles and transforming our electric grid for the future. What I think we are grappling with now is the mineral demand for this future and the speed at which that demand is building. And this conversation is playing out as we face supply chain shocks that are rippling throughout every dimension of our domestic economy. So where are the minerals needed for our electric future going to come from? Here in the US, will they be imported from abroad? Can we harness the power of recycling to supply them? Given the overwhelming needs for materials and the urgency to ramp up production, right now, in the way President Biden has articulated, the answer to each of these questions has to be a resounding yes. Sourcing the materials for our future isn't an either-or question. It's an addition question. No country can afford to sit on the sidelines, and no solution is going to meet the scale of the challenge. Yes, recycling will play a role, but it realistically won't scratch the surface and for what must be achieved. Inevitably, given the pace of the current thirst for these minerals to meet immediate production goals, we will need to turn to our allies around the world, and the US should be doing so very carefully and thoughtfully so that our import dependence isn't weaponized against us by our geopolitical rivals. But it is increasingly clear that we must ramp up domestic mining here at home, and we have the deposits and the resources to do just that. We are our own most secure, dependable supplier, but we need to do more to facilitate the access to these deposits. Here in the US, mine permitting doesn't happen overnight, nor can our current cumbersome mine permitting system be fixed overnight. Although I hope our distinguished panel will get into the improvements that can be made to put the US in a more competitive position in the race for our future. Simply put, there's no getting to where we want to go without increased domestic production of the range of minerals needed for this accelerating EV future. Now, as Jim Farley, Ford President and CEO, recently said, quote, "We have to bring battery production here, but the supply chain has to go all the way to the mines. That's where the real cost is." He went on to say, "We have to solve these things and we don't have much time." Powerful words. We are already on a trajectory where mineral supplies, or their lack of them, will dictate the speed and the breadth of electrification. So there is urgency behind today's discussion, as the US is starting the race years behind. Fortunately, we've seen signs that both the administration and Congress understand that the status quo won't get us where we need to be. The president has issued a number of executive orders on securing America's supply chains that have highlighted the mineral needs of electric vehicles and our transportation infrastructure. And a little more than a week ago, Congress passed and the president signed into law yesterday a bipartisan infrastructure bill that includes mineral permitting reforms, grant programs and financing for critical mineral programs, and funds for geological mapping of mineral resources. So as we examine the United States' role in the world's EV race, we must better prioritize the incentives U.S. mining and embrace it as a critical piece of our transportation future. Thank you again to the Atlantic Council for your leadership on the issue, and to our panelists for sharing your time, and I look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you, Rich, and thanks again to you and your colleagues at the National Mining Association. You've been fantastic partners throughout the past years who worked on this report. Before I open up the panel, I'd like to just take a brief moment to reflect on some of the key themes in this report, many of which Rich highlighted. The first is is at the nexus of the magnitude of global mineral demand growth as a result of energy transition, and the reality that an acceleration of domestic transportation electrification thrusts the United States into the center of an already crowded mineral supply chain. This is something frequently in the background of broader conversations around energy transition and clean energy development. For example, I just returned from Glasgow at COP26, and one of the things that was frequently a surprise is how tight the minerals picture already is. And as we look to the implementation of this new infrastructure deal and the likely incentives for additional EV deployment that will come out of the reconciliation bill, tight minerals markets are only likely to become more constrained on the minerals side. Just to throw a few numbers out there, according to the IEA, we're looking at an addition of nearly 11,000 kilotons of mineral demand just for EVs by 2040 under the Sustainable Development Scenario. This includes, for example, nearly 43 and 41 times the amount of lithium and nickel in demand in 2040 compared to 2020. Meanwhile, the administration projected earlier this year that electrifying just 20% of domestic light-duty vehicles would require approximately 25, 49, and 22% of the global nickel, lithium, and cobalt that was mined in 2019. So the United States is about to consume a whole lot of a rapidly growing minerals demand picture around the world. Both of these demand side data points are especially concerning, given a mismatch between current projections of additional mineral supplies that are going to come online. Projected 2030 production of minerals such as copper, lithium, and cobalt are magnitudes lower than projected demand. This is further compounded by the fact that insufficient investment into new mineral supplies is not really resolving the current status quo, meaning our broader clean energy and not just our EV deployment goals are increasingly running into the harsh mathematical reality of supply-demand imbalances. A second and related point are dynamics of scale, speed, and cost as the United States implements ambitious transportation electrification policies. A target for 50% of EV sales by 2030 means that these mineral demands are going to arrive very quickly, if not already here now. Building 500,000 charging stations, for example, immediately adds a market signal for approximately 4 million kilograms of copper demand to the market. Similar dynamics are going to drive conditions around other EV minerals, such as rare earths, lithium, silicon, and graphite. And in an environment where the supply picture is already very tight and demand is accelerating in some cases exponentially, the risks of passing these market conditions onto the price of an EV are considerable if action is not taken quickly on the supply side. A third point is related to sustainability. The last thing that we want is for emissions reduction benefits of transportation electrification to come at the expense of broader sustainability targets. Here, there's two buckets of action, which I think are worth exploring, in particular for the United States, given the legacy industries it has in both automotive and mining. The first is establishing normative demands for a sustainable mineral supply chain. This includes the environmental and emissions related concerns around rapidly bringing online additional mineral supplies, but also the need for transparency, good governance, and the protection of labor rights across a global mineral supply chain, areas where US automakers, US policymakers, and the US mining industry can add considerable value. A second area is on leading the innovation curve. This includes opportunity to reduce mineral intensity of key components over the long term, such as the cobalt content of EV batteries. And I know GM is doing considerable work there, as well as opportunities to improve the mineral life cycle, from improving the use of tailings from extraction. I know Rio Tinto is doing a lot of that, so we can talk about that, as well as, including to monitor how you can improve the mineral downstream by implementing recycling programs to alleviate a marginal amount of your broader supply concerns. These things considered, and of course, these three items I think are only a glance at the broader market policy and geopolitical drivers present throughout mineral supply chains for EVs and clean energy technologies. But this report offers three kind of core recommendations which should guide how industry and policymakers can ensure that transition minerals and our growing demand for these transition minerals contribute to rather than inhibit EV deployment goals. The first is to aim for an overabundance of mineral supplies by investing in both best-in-class domestic mineral resources and expertise, while also collaborating with partner countries to grow capacity throughout the mineral supply chain. Rich mentioned this in his remarks, and I've colloquially kind of referred to this as an all of the above approach to meeting the mineral demands of the EV deployment story. Simply put, the demand side signals are too great for the United States to take any opportunity to improve the supply picture off the table. The second is to put sustainability front and center of these targets. Policymakers not only have a responsibility to ensure that sustainability is encoded throughout the mineral supply chain, but sustainability in and of itself is an opportunity to unlock additional investment, such as from the fast-growing ESG funds that are powering clean energy finance, to mitigate some of the geopolitical challenges present throughout the global mineral supply chain, and to keep an eye on the innovation potential that is still present throughout the mining industry and automotive industries. Finally, and one area which I think is a really important space to watch, is to encourage and support cross-industry partnerships between the automotive and mining industries. We're already seeing the beginning of major OEMs exploring models for upstream investment and partnerships, and the extent to which policy can de-risk or otherwise support these efforts will only further secure the ability of the US auto industry and the US mining industry to ensure that the electrification of transportation is a success in the United States. All those things said, I'll get off the soapbox now and introduce our panel to kick off what I hope is an interesting discussion on these issues, and hopefully a good shines a light on where these issues are going to be moving forward in the coming year. With that, I'd like to welcome our panelist, Jonathan Evans, Director, CEO, and President of Lithium Americas. Mark Richard, General Manager for International Affairs and Strategy at Rio Tinto Battery Metals. And Mike Mayton, Senior Strategist for Energy, Environment, and Electrification Policy at General Motors. After our panel discussion, I'll open the floor to audience questions. If you would like to ask a question of our panelists, please do so through the Q&A function on Zoom. Unfortunately, if you are watching through YouTube or Twitter, where we're streaming this event, you won't be able to ask questions, but I would encourage you to register, jump in, and ask a question as you can. As a final reminder, for housekeeping's sake, we are on the record. And if you would like to live tweet this conversation, you're more than welcome to. We're using the hashtag AC Energy, and you can find the Global Energy Center's account at AC Global Energy. So To kick things off, I'd like to kind of start our conversation by turning to the demand side of this story. And so, Mike, I'm going to turn to you first. When you look at both the infrastructure bill and how it incentivizes an acceleration of EV deployment in the United States, as well as GM's own commitments to electrifying its fleet that it's been pursuing for the past several years, in fact, what are the challenges and opportunities you're currently seeing in the mineral supply chain, and how are those, how do you see those evolving as, not only GMs, but the rest of the OEMs in the United States, continue to demand more and more and more minerals?
Thanks for the question, Reed, and thanks to you and the Atlantic Council for having me. It's a pleasure to contribute to this report and participate in this panel discussion. So you gave me a great introduction. GM, we've made some really ambitious commitments about our electric vehicle future and our company's transformation. The fact that we're going to be carbon neutral by 2040, the commitment to go all EV in our light duty fleet in the US by 2035. Those commitments have then turned into investments and actions by GM. We've committed to, we've taken action to launch 30 EVs globally by 2025, 20 of those just here in the US. And you're going to see the results of that actually starting this week with the launch of the Hummer EV at Factory Zero tomorrow. So, our investments, our commitments have really started, but behind me is the real story for this panel, quite frankly. And that's to power all of those electric vehicles, we need a lot of batteries. And behind me is an artist rendering of a battery plant that we've announced in Spring Hill, Tennessee. We have also announced one in Lordstown, Ohio, and we've announced actually two more with sites TBD in the US. So a lot of battery capacity coming online in the next several years, again, to support that EV future. These are great factories providing a lot of jobs for the US, but as this panel clearly knows, the raw materials that flow into these battery factories, so the cathode active material, the anodes, the separators, the electrolytes, those right now are by and large supplied from outside the US, mainly from Asia. So the next step in our journey here is with this massive capacity, this battery manufacturing capacity, is to move those supply chains closer to these battery factories. So we are absolutely right in the middle of exploring how to best do that. To either onshore or nearshore some of those processes to get, again, that lithium, that cobalt, that nickel into these factories produced here. Of course, we have four key priorities when we look to move the supply chain to North America. So one is security of supply chain, certainly, sustainability, scalability. This is the four battery plants represent roughly 140 gigawatt hours of battery production. So a massive scale of battery manufacturing, with likely more to come if it's going to support 100% of our US fleet. We also have to do this in a cost competitive way. So, keeping those four pillars in mind, what are the challenges to your question? What are the challenges? I think as I look in terms of where we see, kind of the challenges coming down the pike. Number one, this is a global race. US companies, US OEMs aren't the only region. We're not the only companies that are trying to domesticate the battery supply chain. This is absolutely going on in Europe with strong support from the EU and their member states. So oftentimes we're actually competing with investment dollars for investment dollars as those companies look to build out with their capital, either in Europe or North America. So we have to keep in mind that we're in a global race. Another challenge is frankly the pace of the technology change. Right now we're on a high nickel content battery to get those 300-mile vehicles on the road in the US. Will LFP eventually take off in the U.S.? Will we be able to get cobalt out of our batteries, knowing some of the sustainability challenges or supply bottlenecks in cobalt? So the pace of technical change, we're still on, call it Gen 2.5, Gen 3 batteries. Once we get to 2035, those are going to be Gen 5 batteries. So what are those going to look like? So we're building a supply chain in the middle of this research race to find the right chemistries, whether it's lithium metal anodes or silicon added to the anode. There's the pace of change is really pretty stunning when you're trying to build out a supply chain. Sustainability, obviously a concern. Making sure that these midstream processing, as well as the mining, is sustainable and works for everybody. So recycling certainly a part of that, but also making sure that the energy used is green energy coming from hydro or solar or wind or another form of green energy. And then fourth, and this might apply to some of my partners here on the panel, is just simply the challenge of the time scale for mining and extraction projects. And that's why it's critical that we start now. We think the vehicle development process is long, taking somewhere between 3 and 5 years. These mining projects, frankly, operate on a time scale much longer than that, mostly, sometimes double that time scale. So we just need to keep that in mind. And I think it really highlights the urgency for mining projects or extraction projects that are being explored now. Those might not come online till the late 2020s. So it really is critical that we start now having this conversation about domestic exploration and extraction.
Mm-hmm. I think you highlighted several challenges, which, I mean, hearing an OEM basically say, hey, we need, there is this space is evolving. There's a lot of uncertainty that are, in some ways posing obstacles to our realization of these goals. I think that's a good opportunity to shift to Mark and John. And Mark, I'll start with you. Rio Tinto is one of the largest mining firms in the world. Obviously, growing mineral and material demand is a huge market opportunity. But given two things Mike mentioned, I think the fact that demand continues to evolve in interesting ways as both the scale and kind of composition of that demand evolves, but also the speed at which those new supplies need to come online. I'd be curious, given Rio Tinto's exposure to a range of those minerals and metals that are core to EV deployment, how are you looking at that demand landscape in terms of your preparation to bring on sufficient supply? Are there particular areas of risk for certain minerals, or is it really a question of, hey, we need to get these mines in the ground very, very quickly and we need help doing that? Where are you seeing the landscape? And then I'll turn to John, I think, particularly on the lithium side, because I think there's a lot of concerns there specifically.
Thanks, Reid. And hello or welcome, everybody. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate you, Reid, and the Atlantic Council and other contributors to the report, including the National Mining Association. This is a critical issue that requires innovative thinking, foresight and advanced planning, and the complex balancing of interests. The report lays out the current and the future states clearly and makes a significant contribution to improving people's understanding of what lies ahead. So Rio Tinto is the second largest global diversified mining company. Our operations in the US, specifically in Utah, Arizona, and California, are especially relevant to today's topic. We have the Kennecott mine in Utah, which has been operating for more than 100 years. With one of only 2 operating copper smelters in the country, Kennecott supplies 20% of the US copper demand, as well as various critical minerals, in particular tellurium and rhenium, with the potential for many more. Our new mine development project in Arizona, Resolution Copper, will be able to supply 25% of US copper demand and makes a significant contribution to clean energy technologies, including EVs and advanced manufacturing. We also have a borates mine in Boron, California, from which we're extracting lithium from mine waste, as well as a significant interest in the Tamarack nickel project in Minnesota. So in the US and elsewhere, we have an ambition to build on our existing position in metals that will support the energy transition, including copper, aluminium, and iron ore. Not a typical sort of clean energy mineral or metal, but fundamental to rolling out a lot of the infrastructure associated with the transition. And we also are striving to become a significant player in battery metals such as lithium. So we agree with the state of play described in the report, namely that society at large is demanding change and that the governments and businesses around the world are responding. Rio Tinto is committed to be part of that solution, both through our product suite as described, and various decarbonisation initiatives which are targeted at our emissions and those of our customers. If I can maybe just quickly move to some of the risks. There is the risk to supply that the report speaks to, particularly in copper, lithium, and nickel. So given the time that it usually takes to bring greenfield projects to production, we expect that supply in the short to medium term will largely come from brownfield expansions. And then there's also a risk to the secure supply of other critical minerals, including for technological and market reasons. So on this front, we'd like to see more R&D programs to demonstrate novel technologies to extract and recover critical minerals, procurement policies that recognize the provenance of minerals, and finally, sort of recognition that existing processing facilities such as smelters can offer untapped potential for mineral byproducts. With that, I'll hand it back to you, Reid.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great look at overall how a company like Rio Tinto sees. I mean, you're engaged in any number of specific areas, both in the supply chain as well as I think you articulated a really extensive suite of materials that are going to continue to be really important. I think, let's honing in on lithium briefly. I'd like to turn to you, John. Lithium Americas, you have the Thacker Pass project. You're certainly a smaller, you're not a company that's the size of a Rio Tinto per se, but you nonetheless are filling a very, very specific and urgent need in the demand side that we've spoken a fair amount about thus far. Can you speak a little bit to some of the risks and opportunities you see in that accelerating demand? And I think, in particular, given some of the comments Rich made about, the challenges bringing, new sources of supply on and the need to bring those new sources of supply on quickly in the United States as well as elsewhere. How do you see kind of the policy landscape shaping your ability to help to contribute ultimately to U.S. transportation electrification?
Thanks, Reid. And it's a complicated issue. I really commend the administration. It's the first time I've ever seen industrial policy that's been launched kind of mimics what Japan, Korea, and China all do. The lithium issue is a little different than some of the other minerals, which are very large commodities. You can find pricing benchmarks in large mines that operate. The lithium industry is growing extremely fast and has to grow by orders of magnitude in a really short period of time. It's not a rare mineral. What's rare is finding something that's large enough to tap economically and to put into service. Today, Australia, which is the largest supporter of the lithium industry through spodumene, most of that material, in fact, most all goes actually to China. And if you look at the funding for those mines, because a lot of those companies were smaller that started like our own, a lot of those senior credit facilities are actually sponsored by Chinese companies because they couldn't get funding just a few years ago when the industry seemed like it was going to be growing at a smaller pace. The issue in the U.S. and Canada is absolutely an emergency. We have the sources of lithium here. We have copper, we have cobalt, we have nickel, and the U.S. really needs to expand quickly. Thacker Pass is a piece of that puzzle, but it's not going to answer really the call. There's going to be other projects, and those projects are going to look different. We have different kinds of sources in the U.S. We have spodumene, we have brine, we have sedimentary deposits, we have geothermal type deposits. It's going to be a different recipe for the U.S. and I include Canada in that as well, because I think that's an important aspect to consider. We're going to need our own production here. To Michael's point, If you look at supply chain stability, if you look at improving carbon footprints and life cycle analysis, completing the supply chain all in North America with recycling at the end, you really need to have domestic production. In terms of policy, the government has done some good things now around funding development, making some permit changes, which I think will help. But if you look at demand in the US, it's really actually globally, not so much governments which are doing this, but I mean, to Mike's point, and companies like Ford, the industry is pivoting already. If you look at the announcements in the US over the next coming years of the amount of battery capacity in the US, it's something like 300 or 400 gigawatt hours. It's a massive number. If you add up the amount of lithium needed to support that, it almost is the entire supply today that needs to, just for the US and North American market alone. So it's an important issue. We're ready to help and be part of that solution in North America, but there's going to be other development, and it's difficult, and that funding has been very hard. And I think private capital is the solution for that. The government shouldn't have to pay for all of that. It's been a challenge in the lithium industry because it's been too small in a lot of cases for larger companies to get involved, but I think that's changing now. And I think as larger companies get in the space, that's going to actually help quite a bit to help accelerate. But still, timing is going to be difficult. If you look at projects like Thacker Pass, it's been a decade. And even now, after our permit was issued, an appeal process, which is going to take a year and be cleared up by March, because there's a lot of misinformation around public perception around mining and mineral extraction in the U.S., around it being sustainable, meeting ESG standards, and the industry is totally committed. In fact, it's a requirement to even do business with the OEMs and what customers want at the end of the day. So I think we have all the elements right here in the U.S. And as Michael and Mark both said, it's a race. Everybody needs to develop their own supplies. There are some open areas like Argentina right now, which of course is not going to need the amount of lithium that they have in terms of deposits there. And if you look at the investment, just over the last 8 weeks, there's been 3 announcements. It's all Chinese companies which are funding that, because they have a plan that's been in place now for the last decade or more of really having a very commanding presence and that includes having stability in their raw material supply chains. And that has to be global, then so be it. They'll do it globally. So we need to move quickly in the US, but we can. We won't be self-sufficient, but of course we can have a lot more stability than we have now. And there's quite a bit of resources here that we can develop quickly to have some amount of domestic production from mine all the way through recycling.
Mm-hmm. This is something that the three of you have touched on. So I might throw this question to the entire panel and let whomever wants it grab it. John, you mentioned, everybody here has mentioned the investment and the challenges of economics, right? And the investment side still seems to be improving. But again, the speed at which you need these mineral resources to come online is the big concern currently. And I think, John, you also mentioned, these demand signals are coming increasingly in the absence of policy, right? The GMs, the Fords, et cetera, they're moving in this direction regardless of the policy signal. And while we saw in, this administration some really positive momentum to explore permitting reform, to, support the supply side, do we need, what other sort of policy angles or levels of policy support do we need to either improve the sustainability of the supply chain, to encourage additional capital inflows into the street? Do we need something like, increased policies from increased direct investment from the government, a more aggressive, almost industrial strategy to what you mentioned, John? What in the policy space, what policy tools currently really are missing to ensure that we bring on sufficient supplies of these minerals quickly, and if that means a moving towards a more reshored mineral supply chain, or at least partially reshored or North American mineral supply chain, how can policy play a role in continuing to incentivize that? And I think Mark, Mike, or John, I'd be curious as to your thoughts, because we're looking at three of you represent different pieces of this picture.
Well, I'm happy to start. I mean,
Yeah, let's let John start.
It's a combination of different things. I think that there are loan guarantees that are available from the Department of Energy, which is something different that we've seen in the past. But you're also going to need almost like an approach that's with the government where you can move very quickly. It's dealing with the government's like a house of mirrors. Going to various different administrations, the permitting process or the grant process actually is quite complicated. This needs to be almost like a Manhattan Project type approach where it's a national imperative, and you've got a partner in the government that you can move through these things quickly. But I think also you can overlay some guidance and standards here where we can ensure things are done and the public is confident that it's done in a way that's sustainable and within all the rules and regulations that we have. Because I think public perception in some cases, there are groups that ideologically are never going to be for what all of us are talking about here, or that we can recycle our way to success. You can't recycle what you don't have. We actually have to put and build the infrastructure out there. And as Michael know, cars last 10 years as you start retiring these batteries and you start having these large batteries coming offline. It becomes economical to actually recycle them. And eventually we'll close the loop like lead acid batteries where you're not going to have to continually look for mines around the world. This supply chain can actually be circular at some point in the future. When you get 15, 20 years down the road, it'll really start feeling that way. But I think we need a coordinated policy in our government, along with like with the mining reforms that we've done, the permitting reforms. You need to have some limits in terms of how long some of these things can last. There are projects in this country that have been in the permitting process for 20 years. That's the reason why investment, even today, people don't want to come off the sidelines, because that's a really bad return on your money. Yeah. So whether the EIS process, I think now it's been limited at 2 years, that's great. A yes or a no and some guidance from the government on what you need to do to improve, or this project's never going to go forward. We need that type of guidance and those types of rules where we can move things along. So I'll leave to my colleagues to add more, especially Rich.
Yeah, Mark or Mike, any particular thoughts on kind of what are the next big policy initiatives you're looking to kind of improve, either facilitate additional investment in this space, shorten the runway so we can meet some of these speed constraints that we're seeing in order to bring these vehicles online quickly. What do you see the policy landscape is evolving into or needing to evolve into?
I'm happy to add here. And I think the panel spoke before about there multiple pieces of the puzzle that need to come together to try and solve this supply issue. And I think the same applies to the policies required. There's no single silver bullet policy or solution to this. So we will need coordinated and comprehensive policies that look at the permitting and sort of exploration and development of greenfield resources. We'll also need policies, et cetera, that look at how we can extract or develop resources from sort of within existing processing and sort of that phase of production. And then similarly with the recycling phase, this is a complicated puzzle, and I think the policy response needs to reflect that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. Mike, any thoughts on the policy side?
Yeah, and I'd echo what John and Mark said. I think those are good. I'll just add a couple points as we look at it from an OEM, and remember, we're kind of looking at it from the car backwards to the mine. My colleagues here are looking at it from the mine forwards. But as we look at that, there's a lot of research and development around battery chemistries, right? And getting that the right chemistry, that the energy density up, the cost down. I think policy and the government can play a role in research and development on the midstream. Oftentimes the cathode active material production, the anode production, those aren't they're energy intensive processing, not real environmentally friendly right now. And largely those companies are right now based out of Asia. So can the U.S., in addition to supporting, the battery research with some of the great companies that exist, can we support some of that midstream? And it's certainly not as sexy, but that cathode and anode and midstream research. We ship stuff all over the country, all over the world as sulfates today. That's not particularly friendly, right? You put them into sulfates, you then strip it out. Are there other greener ways to move these minerals around? So I agree. While I agree, mining and extraction are important. I don't want to forget about those midstream processes and the opportunity that exists there for maybe some American innovation to occur in that. And I guess the other thing I'd mention, and I think a couple people, John alluded to it, is this really needs to be a continental approach. We need to bring our neighbors to the north in Canada with their rich mineral deposits, their green energy. We really need to make this kind of a coordinated approach with the Canadian government to, again, to secure that supply chain. So a lot of nickel up there, a lot of cobalt. And even some lithium, I think, John. But we really need to make this a coordinated approach. They have a strong interest in building out the supply chains from what we've seen in Canada. So we'd really love the U.S. to kind of work together to figure out how to kind of optimize that whole picture. So again, and John, you hit it on the head. Eventually, we're going to get to a closed loop economy here for battery raw materials, but you need to get those minerals into the economy first before you can close that loop.
One thing I think, at first, before I move on, I think we've been dancing around this idea of sustainability. So I'd like to push on that a bit more. But first, before I move into that piece, just a reminder to our audience, the Q&A function is now open. If you would like to ask a question via Zoom, just use that Q&A and drop it in, and I'll work those questions into our discussion. On the sustainability front, I think, John, you mentioned we're eventually going to get to a closed loop mineral life cycle, but we need to get there first. We've talked about a bit how the current mineral supply chain or the sustainability concerns associated with that supply chain are frequently due to environmentally unfriendly practices elsewhere. Or there are labor rights associated with, we're all well aware of the challenges around the labor challenges around cobalt extraction, particularly in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That's a reality that I think adds to some of the geopolitical supply chain pressures we're seeing, but nonetheless is an area where the United States and North America, in fact, to use a region that both John and Mike have mentioned, can add value both through their own sustainable practices, but also on the innovation curve. When, I'll start with, you, Mark, because I think Rio Tinto has done some initial early interesting stuff on the sustainability side in terms of, your full value mining projects that you developed using mine tailings more efficiently to, draw mineral byproducts out. How do you see that piece of the sustainability conversation adding to our broader, conversation about mineral supply chains, and almost what more needs to be done? What are the next big steps to, build a sustainable, well-governed, transparent mineral supply chain?
Thanks, Reid. So I guess from a battery materials and a critical minerals perspective, where Rio Tinto is actively working on the exploration and strategy side to identify attractive growth options. But as you referred to, also is exciting is that we're focusing on maximizing the value of our existing ore bodies and surrounding deposits. So this includes mining our waste, as well as valorizing byproducts from existing processing activities. So one example of that is at Kennecott, where tellurium and rhenium are being or will be recovered. And as I mentioned before, the tailings at Kennecott contain many more materials that have been classified as critical by the US government. Other examples at Boron, we've recently built a demonstration plant to transform a century's worth of mining waste into battery-grade lithium, and are now looking at the potential to build a full-scale production plant which could produce enough lithium to power 70,000 EV batteries. And sort of from that sustainability or full mining sort of perspective, it's without the need to construct or expand the footprint of mines. Mm-hmm. Another example is in our titanium business. So titanium itself is a critical mineral, but we're also producing monazite and scandium as co-products or byproducts. Monazite from our QMM operation, with limited additional costs and strong market demand, which therefore provides excellent margins. And then high quality scandium in Canada, and there'd been references to the sort of the North American approach rather than a US specific approach. So with this plant, we will be the first large scale producer of scandium in the Western world, with capacity to supply approximately 20% of the global market. So a good example of a clear market with high margins and a model that's scalable. And these things build off each other. So to be able to, the scandium market was sort of very uncertain previously, but now that we've been able to crack the code and develop a reliable supply, it generates significant sort of flow-on benefits to that. So our scandium business sits alongside our world-class aluminium business, and that means that we're well positioned to produce scandium or aluminium scandium alloys. And that's it's been really exciting to see how that has sort of built on itself and is creating other opportunities.
Mm-hmm. John, I want to give you an opportunity to jump in on the sustainability conversation. I think Lithium Americas has a strong value proposition on the sustainability side. How do you continue to build that narrative, right? That we can make mining more and more and more sustainable, and that itself can be a value add for the United States, not just as it meets its own domestic mineral demands, but also tries to establish, again, we're all talking about a race here, establish a stronger position in a globally expanding mineral supply chain.
Well, thanks, Reed. And I think for us and for just Rio Tinto and all the companies in this space, transparency is really key. We're an adherent to IRMA and ICCM. There's other standards out there that, as part of that, you have to do the math and show actually the impact. In some cases, for some of these things, all the way back through the community as well, which is another aspect which we should talk about. But it's good design, it's good engineering when you put these things together. And for us, things like cogeneration for our reagent plant, which is on site to generate power, and for the remaining power that we need, tying into sustainable power resources, whether it be hydro or in the case of Nevada, you can tie into geothermal. Being conservative on water and recycling. Putting in the latest technologies to reduce or eliminate any air emissions, even visual, when you design these facilities, where they blend in with the environment, or as you're mining, designing it such that you're doing concurrent backfilling, where the pit is only open maybe 30-35% at a time. All of this comes with an additional cost, which is essential, but it's also supported by the market now, where got enough, actually more than enough demand, where you can do this correctly, which I think you're right. The US, Canada can lead in this because you're entering the industry at a different point. We have to be fast, but we can also make the right level of investment now where it can be done right, because you can't export this. We've seen that already in solar panels and silicon and so forth. And especially with climate change, it's like squeezing a balloon. The impact is still the same to the globe. We should do those things here. And the other pillar I mentioned is the community. So a lot of the communities that a lot of us operate in are pretty remote, bringing economic development, You have to train the workforce actually locally, because especially in the environment we're in now, it's really difficult to find people. So making those investments early, educating the public, and also ensuring a lot of those benefits return back to those local communities, which in a lot of cases can be in parts of states that are pretty depressed. I think it's a real opportunity for us to do good across the board. But again, we have to be committed to being completely transparent too, which we are.
Yeah. I think I want to pull on that workforce development piece briefly, but first I want to give Mike the opportunity to jump in on this sustainability question, particularly, tying off of something that you mentioned, John, which is the way that these sustainability demands are now being communicated through, there's a demand signal for sustainability in a lot of ways. Mike, how does a company like GM, right, communicate that demand signal upwards through the supply chain? One of the things we've talked a lot about over the past, in a broader conversation about transition minerals is what are the tools for verification to ensure that you're getting, your minerals from a sustainable source? And a lot of that speaks to what John just said about transparency. What is GM, planning to do to, communicate with its upstream partners and partners in the midstream and the upstream that it expects these minerals to be produced sustainably?
Yeah, I think, it starts with membership in groups like RMI, like Responsible Mineral Initiative, like IRMA, as John mentioned, to that have auditing processes for sustainable minerals. But if I can just talk a little bit about GM from an OEM perspective, in a perfect world, you would have a mine, a processing refining plant, a battery plant, a car plant, and a recycling facility, all literally in the same place. We know that's not the perfect world, right? We have a defined footprint of our automotive manufacturing facilities. We're defining that footprint for the batteries. So, how do we? And I just hit on the point that Jonathan mentioned. Transport is frankly plays a key role here in the entire emission story. So what's the most efficient way to transport these minerals? What's the most effective way to extract them? On the extraction piece, we're definitely exploring different extraction methods. So our investment in Controlled Thermal Resources in the Salton Sea in California, using direct lithium extraction to get the lithium out of the brine out there. That's an example of something we're exploring as a sustainable, right? It's geothermal energy. It's a strong lithium supply. It's in a economically disadvantaged community. It really checks a lot of boxes for the things that we want to represent in terms of sustainability. So we're excited about that project. But again, just to your example, I think it really starts with making sure our supply chain partners share the same values that we do in terms of their sustainability goals, using green energy or moving to the use of green energy for this processing.
Mm-hmm. I think I want to turn to one question before I give each of you a kind of a big question to wrap up. And I think, John, you mentioned this, and I'd be curious, Mark, if you have any thoughts as well on this. There's a question from our audience, specifically asking about workforce development, right? And how do we, and part of, I think, when we talk about investment in the U.S. mining industry, part of that is actually preparing the workforce of the future to succeed in this industry, making sure that we have the sufficient education programs for mining engineers. John, John or Mark, what are your thoughts on how do we establish that U.S. workforce, not just to, encourage young folks to get involved in this space, but empower the industry as a whole to leverage the human capital that it's long held throughout the global mining industry?
Well, it starts early. I think some of the policies that have been passed allow for some investments at universities, but it actually takes companies like ours reaching out, the local or regional universities to help those pipelines. We work close with the University of Nevada at Reno and just starting to work with Carnegie Mellon University now. I'll tell you, this is an industry that hasn't traditionally been very a destination industry for graduates. And this is an opportunity actually to engage the workforce at a much earlier point in their career where, look, I get unsolicited resumes all week of people that want to be a part of this, which typically chemical manufacturing plants and mining, it hasn't been a dream job for somebody. Maybe it was 40 years ago, but it is now because you're part of something bigger, stopping climate change, decarbonizing the economy. And we're having a lot of luck actually attracting folks that are still in school, in some cases graduate school, people that are graduating with their PhDs. So I think the opportunity is here, but it takes engagement, just like it does in the community, to do skills mapping for training for heavy equipment operation or welding or things like that. That's important as well. In addition to engagements with universities, first via through internships and so forth, but actually bringing folks on board so that you have that next generation. Because what we do here isn't black magic. It's chemical engineering, it's mining engineering, it's stuff that you do learn in school. You're just applying it to a little bit different industry. Look, the folks that are doing our excavation in Nevada, North American Resources, they're a coal company. I mean, those fungible skills that you can put into now an industry which is completely other end of the spectrum, but the skill set's the same.
Mm-hmm. Mark, I want to give you the opportunity to weigh in there. Any thoughts on, the workforce development? How do you catalyze getting the talent into resolving these these big challenges about, establishing sufficient supply, tracing sustainability throughout the supply chain, et cetera. Where does Rio Tinto is a massive company? What are you guys thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd agree with John. I think now is a fantastic opportunity, and the sector has suffered from, I guess, something of an image problem, or it hasn't been seen as a destination for great talent. But we need to get better at selling the role that the sector has in solving these global problems, and the different opportunities that the sector presents from sort of chemical engineering, et cetera, to being part of some really exciting partnerships, et cetera, all along the value chain, et cetera. And, I look at what different people and, such talented people are doing in different parts of our business and other businesses within the sector. And it's truly exciting.
Mm-hmm. So with an eye to the clock, I want to ask one last question to each of you to give you the opportunity to kind of wrap things up. Mike, I'll turn to you first. It looks like, if you had asked me a few, years ago, kind of what is going to be happening in the mineral space, my answer then would have been completely different. Wouldn't have said that we would be as urgently talking about these supply chain issues as we are currently, especially here in DC. From GM's perspective and from your perspective as an expert in this space, where do you see the next year and a half of action for GM in this space? And I think I might particularly hinge that on your comments about the need to act quickly and build upon a question that was asked in our audience that said, you mentioned onshoring or nearshoring these North American supply chains. What does the timeline look for those various items? So I'd let you kind of answer broadly to either of those two items as a kind of a wrap up.
Sure. Thanks, Reed. So I think in response to where the next year takes us, or the next year and a half, I think there will be a focus on the nearshoring of and onshoring of the midstream processing. Right, we have those battery plants built, one coming online next year, one coming on the following year. We want to, as quickly as possible, get those midstream, get those cathodes, those anodes, the copper, the separator, the electrolytes, source those from plants here in North America. So there's an urgent need, and that's somewhere between call it a 3-4 year process, in broad terms. But it's just as urgent in the next year, and Jonathan and Mark are going to start smiling, is to start on that mining process and the extraction and having those conversations about permitting and how we speed things up for extraction in North America, because we know, frankly, that's not a 3 to 4 year process. That's a 7 to 8 year, 10-year process. And when you look at what the demand is going to be by 2030, with half of the vehicles on the being sold as EVs, there's an urgent need now, so that demand curve doesn't outstrip that supply curve as it does right now, depending on the study you're looking at, and the mineral you're looking at sometime in the late 20s. So I think there's an urgent need kind of on both midstream and upstream processing to get started now, and figure out where the federal government with the bipartisan infrastructure package that could go a long way. Some of those funds to really jumpstarting a lot of this work.
I think Mark and John, I think that teed you up really well for your final words in this space. You kind of have a call to action from Mike there. He's looking at a 3 to 4 year time horizon for his goals. Obviously, that's still really challenging given the amount of time it takes to bring a new mine online. Where are you seeing the immediate next steps that need to be taken in order to, really get the ball moving from the goals, the early policy steps that have been taken to actually succeeding in these supply chain challenges and opportunities? I think we'll start with Mark, and then John, I'll let you have the last word.
Thanks, Reid. I completely agree with the urgency of the situation. So we've spoken about the time it takes to get greenfield resources, into production, into market. But even the coordination and the R&D and innovation that's required at other points in the or other potential sort of contributors to solving these problems, all of them will take significant time and coordination. So absolutely urgent. I think the more collaboration there can be, we need to leverage different positions and knowledge and resources, etc. But we need to move quickly from sort of identifying issues and discussing them to actually sort of translating that into real action.
Mm-hmm. John, same question to you. Any last words on kind of where you're seeing the next year to 4 years needing to play out?
I think it's transparency and collaboration all up and down the supply chain. That continental approach that Michael mentioned as well, because we should view this market as a North American market, as resources in both countries that are untapped, and speed, and with an investment behind that as well. We can do it. We have all the resources here in our continent here to be successful, and we have to. We're not going to be able to rely on other regions of the world because, frankly, they have their own issues. And they're going to want their own supply as the market itself, carbon footprints, all those things are important, and they're going to be regionalized. Just like the automotive supply chains are today, you're going to see that mimic over the next 20 years. So speed is the key here. And the money is starting to flow. The government policy is here as well, but we can't buy time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you spoke to specifically collaboration across the supply chain, which is one area that we didn't get to talk about as much as perhaps I would have liked over the past hour, and we're already over time. But I guess from that respect, I'd be doing my job as a think tanker to create the demand signal for more work on our end. So it's another event, it's another project. I've done my job. But that wraps up our time for today. I'd like to thank our panelists. We've laid out a really compelling conversation for policymakers, business leaders, across the board to really think through these challenges as we pursue our transportation electrification goals. As we finish up, I'd like to once again thank the National Mining Association for their partnership on this project, as well as my colleagues here at the Atlantic Council, Patty Ryan, Lauren Holland, and Michael Mateer, who were critical in pulling this particular session together. And lastly, for those who joined late, the video and recap for this event will be found on the Atlantic Council webpage alongside a copy of this report, which is now live. And I would encourage all of you to continue to follow the Global Energy Center's work in this space. Mineral supply chains and geopolitics are going to be a major issue for EV goals and climate goals writ large over the next several years. And I think we'll be doing a lot more to look out for. So with that, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everybody who joined us today. And I hope to see you all again very soon.